Catherine Booth was the co-founder, along with her husband, William Booth, of the Salvation Army, and Catherine Booth was a well-known speaker. People who are of nobility, people who are poor, any class of society loved to come and listen to her talks. And one day she made it to a certain city and she gave a beautiful talk. And a well-to-do lady who was there listening to her talk invited her to dinner. And as they sat down to dinner, she said, "Mrs. Booth, I'm sorry to inform you, but that was the worst talk I've ever been to." She said, "I looked at those people's faces across the table from me with their long faces and how terrible they looked, and I could hardly think that I could sleep tonight because of what I saw." Mrs. Booth responded, she said, "Well, my dear, don't you know them?" And the woman said, "Well, certainly not." And the hostess replied, "Well, aren't they interesting? Aren't they theirs? Aren't they those that you know?" And she said, "Aren't they your neighbors? I didn't bring them with me." The golden rule: love your neighbor as yourself, which we hear in today's gospel. It's not just a Christian thing. Every conceivable religion and culture in the world has a golden rule that kind of forms us in how to live our lives and how to treat one another. Listen to these examples. Judaism: what is hateful to you, do not to your fellow man. That is the law, and all the rest is commentary. Islam: no one of you is a believer until he desires for his brother that which he desires for himself. Hinduism: this is the sum of duty. Do not unto others which would cause you pain if done to you. And Buddhism: hurt not others in ways that you yourself would find hurtful. If that golden rule was so well known in ancient culture, why then did Christ spend so much time teaching it as if it was something new? If all of these different religions had this same thought, why would Christ then place something new in front of us? It's because Jesus brought a completely new understanding to the commandment. The golden rule is understood differently in different religions and cultures, and the key to its understanding lies in the question that the lawyer asked Jesus in today's gospel: who is my neighbor? It's a question we can ask ourselves. Who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor that I have an obligation to love? Among those of Jesus' times, there were those who understood neighbor in a very limited sense. The Essenes, for example, required new members to swear to love the children of light and to hate the children of darkness. For them, your neighbor is the one who shares the same religious passions, the same religious beliefs as you. That's your neighbor. And if they don't believe what you don't believe, then they're not. And then, of course, there were the zealots. And their understanding of neighbor included only those who shared the same nationality and ethnicity with them. If they weren't of their nationality, you are certainly not my neighbor. They're outsiders. The circle of neighborly love does not include them. And Jesus came into the world of the we and the them. And he said to them, it has to be different. The world shows hostility and disregard for your stranger and your enemies. But let me tell you a story about a man who was robbed and beaten and left by the roadside, and how a priest came by and he walked on the opposite side of the road. Another man came along and he disregarded him. But a Samaritan, someone who does not like the Jews, who does not care for them, who wouldn't even go close to them, he sees this man and he has mercy and he has compassion on him. The new thing in Jesus' teaching of neighborly love is his insistence that all humanity is one neighbor. Thus, he broke down those walls of division and suspicion that humans erect between us and them. To bring home this point, he tells the story of that Good Samaritan, like I said. This man regards as an enemy, number one, by the Jewish establishment, simply because he's a Samaritan, is the one who finally proves himself to be the neighbor to the Jewish man in need. And to the question, who is my neighbor? Jesus' answer is anyone and everyone, without exception. And the same applies to you and me. How do we treat our neighbor? How do we treat the person who lives right next door to us? How do we treat the person who lives on the other side of town? What about the divisions that we've created between those who live in the city and those who live in the suburbs or the country? We've created divisions right here in our own neighborhoods. But is that the golden rule? Is that what Christ came to bring? Today is the day to identify and tear down all those boundaries we have erected between those who belong to us and therefore are deserving of our love and concern and those who don't. Sometimes there are ethnic and racial issues. They could also be social and economic, as in the divide between suburbs and neighborhoods, between inner city and outer city. The gospel challenges all of us, to dismantle those boundaries. This way we work with Jesus to realize his dream of a world as a neighborhood without limits. And the man turned and said, or Jesus said to him, which of these, in your opinion, was neighbor to the robber victim? And he answered, the one who treated him with mercy. And Jesus said, go and do likewise. No exceptions. How are we treating our neighbor? Go and do likewise.